On today's installment of Locked On Grizzlies, it is tough being a Memphis fan watching the Dallas Mavericks one game away from the NBA Finals, a team that the Grizzlies are going to have to go through to have their own surge into championship contention. But there are good and bad reasons to be watching and potentially enjoying this Mavericks run to the NBA Finals. I'll talk about that and why waiting seems to be the hardest part. All that and more on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It is a Tuesday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. I am so happy to be with you. It is I, Joe Mullinax, back with Locked On Grizzlies audience members, our dear listeners, our dear viewers. Happy to be with you. No to Michael Cole. He's enjoying an extended Memorial Day as well. He should and deserves to do so. But I am with you coming out of the long weekend. I hope you had fun. I hope you were safe if you were traveling, whatever your way of experiencing the holiday. Hopefully it was enjoyable for you, and hopefully you remembered the reason for the day, as I like to talk to folks about. Not going to get on my soapbox, but remembering those that have given everything so that we can enjoy the freedoms that we have in the United States of America. If you're listening internationally, Memorial Day, of course, our way of honoring those who have passed away in defense of the United States of America. So thank you to all those who serve and who have served, and thank you for joining us on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, however you get your podcasts. Apple, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube. Check us out, comment, let us know how we're doing, and most importantly, check out every episode as it drops. We've had a pretty strong May, plan on finishing the week strong, and heading into June and heading into the summer with the same kind of energy that hopefully you've come to expect from DeMichael Cole and myself here on Locked On Grizzlies. But it's just me on this Tuesday, and I want to take some time. We're going to go 2+ segments here, talking about the Dallas Mavericks. And no, it's not because Nick Angstad is technically mine and DeMichael's boss, and he hosts the Locked On Mavs podcast. He works a ton over at Locked On NBA. He does a great job. And it's not just because I want to suck up to Nick, although Nick is great. I'm very happy for him, as I would be for any Locked On host whose team is having so much success. So obviously the Celtics very much in that mix as well. And it seems like there's a collision course, right? The Boston Celtics, the Dallas Mavericks, all signs point to that being what the NBA Finals are going to be here in 2024. And for me, that comes as bittersweet, right? Because on one hand, the Western Conference looks stronger than it ever has. And that's exciting because you want this next era of NBA basketball as players like LeBron James and Steph Curry, Kawhi Leonard, Kevin Durant, over the next few seasons as they age out. You want the league to be in good hands. And I think that this next era of NBA basketball is not necessarily going to be the LeBron era or the Michael Jordan era. I think this is arguably the most talented the league has ever been. And you have numerous guys who can kind of carry that mantle over the next decade or so. That's exciting to me. And Luka Doncic is most certainly, again, this is a more Mavericks focused conversation. Luka is very much in the mix to be that guy. He is a reminder of how far the international game has come. Him, Jokic, of course, Giannis, numerous international players that are making first team all NBA MVP-esque performances. Doncic has really added to his legend in these first 3 games of the Western Conference Finals, heading into a likely trip to the NBA Finals. But that is also bitter to swallow because the Dallas Mavericks are very much a team that if the Grizzlies want to get to where Dallas is, they are going to have to go through. They are going to have to attack and find a way to defeat. And I have talked about that for the last couple of years, to be honest with you, not just here on Locked On Grizzlies, but when I was writing over at Grizzly Bear Blues, when I was the site manager for Grizzly Bear Blues, when it was part of SB Nation, I would always look at how things were shaping up in the Western Conference and say, if you're going to win in the West, you need to find someone that can slow Luka Doncic. No one can stop Luka Doncic, but you have to find a way to slow him down. And if you don't have a player that is capable of doing that, you're going to get cooked. Now, theoretically speaking, McDaniels for the Minnesota Timberwolves should be a guy that can do that, right? He's got length. He's got size to him. He's athletic. Laterally, he can move. He's one of the better perimeter defenders in the NBA. And maybe you're sitting there and thinking to yourself, Joe, there is no way to slow down or stop Luka Doncic. That's why he's Luka Doncic. That might be true. And that's one of the scariest parts about what we're witnessing from this Dallas Mavericks run. It's not just how phenomenal Luka has been, because he has been tremendous. It's been the partnership with him and Kyrie Irving being a little bit better than I think most of us anticipated it being. At least me. I can certainly speak for myself and say, historically speaking, around the NBA, you don't see a team with two ball-dominant guards like this have the type of success that Dallas is having. Now, what are the reasons for that? The roster construction. Nobody else really in that starting lineup needs the ball handling, so Kyrie and Luka can almost do a true 50-50 split. Excuse me. Whatever the case might be, Kyrie and Luka, two guys who arguably are top 15 or so, certainly Luka, but it depends on where you place Kyrie, top 15 or so talents in the NBA. Them working so well together as ball-dominant guards is mildly surprising. It is something that has added to their success. And it should bring concern for Grizzlies fans, because now there's not just one dominant stopper. If you want to try to throw everything at Luka, he's certainly more than capable of making passes out of double teams. And he's passing to Kyrie Irving, who's playing some of the most beautiful basketball that he's ever played in his career. So assuming that those two are able to stay together long term, that is a reason for concern. That is what makes me most nervous, is this is not necessarily a flash in the pan thing. The Dallas Mavericks, especially coming out of the trade deadline, are built to last. Now, there's reasons to be optimistic coming out of that, and we'll talk more about that later in the show. The Grizzlies are more similar to Dallas than perhaps people realize, and they certainly can be more like Dallas coming out of the NBA draft. But the Mavericks should scare, or at least draw the respect of the Memphis Grizzlies. A, because Luka Doncic, outside of Nikola Jokic, is probably the best player on the planet right now. I think the Boston Celtics are the better team. Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Derek White, Drew Holiday, Kristaps Porzingis, assuming he gets cleared by the finals, because he certainly doesn't need to play in the Eastern Conference Finals. That Celtics team has some of the most elite depth and collection of good players that we've seen in some time in the NBA. But the Celtics are in the Eastern Conference. The Grizzlies could play Boston in the NBA Finals next year, and everybody would be rejoicing. You worry about that problem when it comes across your desk. The Celtics are not the main concern. In order for Memphis to get to those finals, they have to go through Luka Doncic now. Somebody who has ascended into top 5 clearly, potentially top 2 player in the NBA stratosphere. He has found a strong working relationship with Kyrie Irving that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon, and the Mavericks are now built to last. They have the capacity to be able to go out and run this thing back. And as they establish themselves with Gafford, with Washington, with other pieces that have been added, the sky, theoretically, since they've got a guy like Luka Doncic, potentially the best perimeter player in the NBA, sky might be the limit. And Memphis has to contend with that for the next several years. And that makes me nervous. I don't know if it makes you nervous or not. Let me know if I'm overanalyzing, overly concerned about the strength of Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving as a duo, Luka in general. Those two guys, I think I'm taking against just about anybody except maybe Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. And that includes Memphis' own John Morant, Desmond Bane. Jaren Jackson Jr. adds an interesting level to it. And that's something that we'll talk about next here on Locked On Grizzlies, because it's not all doom and gloom. There are reasons watching this Dallas Mavericks team, I feel we can rejoice as Grizzlies supporters, Grizzlies fans, Grizzlies media, whatever you want to call me. We can be excited too. And we're going to talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in both the NBA and NHL playoffs. And FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your very own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. You heard me right. $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and so much more. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count, whether it's hockey, basketball, all of the above. FanDuel is America's #1 sports book. And again, $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more at FanDuel.com/lockedon. Check them out today. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we are chatting up positive vibes coming out of the Dallas Mavericks rise. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax. No DeMichael Cole on this Tuesday edition of the show. An extended Memorial Day break for him from Locked On Grizzlies. Understandable. Happy to fill in for my partner each and every time. We should be back together for our Wednesday show, and we'll close out the week with some strong episodes. Close out May with some strong episodes talking about the draft, start previewing free agency, that sort of thing. And that free agency preview, to be honest with you, starts right now. Because one of the things that I am most excited about regarding the rise of the Dallas Mavericks is Memphis has the potential to do exactly what Dallas is doing in a couple of different ways. Number one, there are players that have been added to the Mavericks that the Grizzlies could theoretically target coming up in this very important summer in free agency that can change their landscape as a contender. Exhibit A, Derrick Jones Jr. for the Dallas Mavericks, who has been a phenomenal signing for Dallas on the veterans minimum. You have to hit on those kinds of signings. You have to. Because if you don't have the depth that is required to make a run in the postseason. It doesn't exist. So when you miss on a veteran signing like a Derrick Rose to this point, and you don't have the capacity to add beyond that, it can hurt your team, especially as your money gets tighter and tighter, as Memphis is experiencing between John Morant, Jaren Jackson Jr., and Desmond Bane having those 9-figure term of the contract deals. So signing a guy like Derrick Jones Jr., who has shown a lot of defensive versatility, and Evan Sittery did a great job pointing this out on X. I want to give him credit. Fully read his post here, or at least part of his post. Defensive versatility, elite athleticism, improving three-point shot. It's going to help this player cash out as an unrestricted free agent at 27 years old. This is not going to be a show where I talk about guys that I would be interested in. We'll save that. It's a long offseason coming up, right? Technically, we're still in season here with the playoffs. So I'll save free agency targets for another episode. But I love that point that Evan made at eCittery on X. 27-year-old veteran minimum signing, given an opportunity to show what he's physically capable of doing, and he's taken advantage of it. He's taken advantage of it, and now he's going to see a bigger contract somewhere else. Dallas probably isn't going to re-sign him. They're not going to be able to. Someone else will pay him. And that's fine. Memphis can be that launching point too. But you have to pick the right veteran minimum guy. Someone who can be that versatile player, who doesn't need to score the ball to be successful, but when they're open can knock down shots. Derrick Jones Jr. has hopped around the league. He was a part of those Miami Heat teams, but this is him kind of finding a career second wind. The Memphis Grizzlies can do similar stuff. They're going to have the capacity. They're going to be able to bring in somebody like a Derrick Jones Jr. Now, their roster is going to be tight. The numbers may not flesh out. It depends on how they draft, what they use the draft for. But that's a big piece of this. Finding cheap veterans who either are older and towards the end of their career, like a Derrick Rose, but he hasn't fleshed out so far. Or Derrick Jones Jr., who is 27 years old, trying to show he should get another opportunity. And making it attractive enough in Memphis to show that you can provide that opportunity to a guy like a Derrick Jones Jr. Obviously, it won't be Derrick Jones Jr. He's going to sign for more than Memphis can probably afford in the offseason. But what can the Grizzlies do like Dallas, or at least of the same mindset? They could do better signing those veteran-type players. Another thing that the Grizzlies can do, and I've talked about this a little bit, and by a little bit, I mean a lot. We've talked about Derek Lively and how important he's been to the Dallas Mavericks. But it's not just Lively. It's P.J. Washington. It's Daniel Gafford. There's numerous bigs on this Dallas lineup who are problems for the Minnesota Timberwolves and for other teams, maybe even the Boston Celtics in a hypothetical, probable NBA Finals matchup. These teams are having to contend with vertical lob threats. They are having to contend with versatile rim protection. They are having to deal with bigs who can do multiple things, not just shoot the three. Why does that matter to the Memphis Grizzlies? Well, let's break down the roster. Jaren Jackson Jr. has a versatile skill set. He can break guys down off the dribble. Obviously, we know what he can do as a rim protector, especially weak side if he's playing the four. Brandon Clark, going into this offseason fully healthy, a chance to work on his game and not have to worry about injury rehab like he had to do last summer. A versatile defensive big, can move, can do a lot of different things as a vertical threat. That was one of my biggest concerns, right? One of the things I was most worried about. I questioned the value of medical science. I was proven wrong. Brandon Clark looks pretty darn good, or at least he looked pretty darn good. And as you watch Daniel Gafford and other bigs for Dallas take advantage of folks collapsing on Luka Doncic, what do you think they're going to do to John Morant in the pick and roll? What do you think they're going to do? Similar things, especially if Ja is able to add that mid-range game to his offense. And that's going to create vertical lob threats, which Memphis has possibilities for already on the roster. And then at number 9 overall, the Memphis Grizzlies will be able to secure the services of a big. Will it be Donovan Clingan? I hope so. Could it be Zach Edey? Maybe. I think that's a little high for him still, but we still have time to break that down. We'll bring on Rafael Barlow at some point, and he can talk through his big board with us. Memphis can address the big man situation through the draft in a variety of ways and add another piece like Dallas did to fortify their front court and make themselves stronger so that Jaren can be his best self at the 4, and so that you have a backcourt of Ja and Dez who can focus on creating for themselves and for others, whether it's in the pick and roll or in other types of sets, as the Memphis offense diversifies. Everything that I just said is completely realistic. There is no, the Grizzlies should be optimistic because they can just trade for Jaylen Brown. That ship has sailed, right? Karl Anthony Towns isn't coming here either. The Grizzlies don't have the flexibility, the contracts. They're not going to be able to make that work. At least not without it making no sense, because they'd have to trade Morant or Bane or Jaren Jackson Jr., and I wouldn't want to move on from any of those guys. And nor should you, dear listener, dear viewer. So, why should Memphis be optimistic looking at what the Mavericks are doing, even though they have to go through Dallas next season, even though they have to contend with Luka? Because a lot of the things that Dallas is succeeding with, adding bigs that can be vertical threats, not necessarily just three-point shots, three-point threats. P.J. Washington can shoot the three, but so can Jaren Jackson Jr. Daniel Gafford's a phenomenal vertical threat, but so is Brandon Clark. You add a true rim protector to that mix, and all of a sudden, the Grizzlies' front court looks a heck of a lot like the Mavericks' front court. Memphis doesn't have a Luka, but they do have a Ja Morant, and if you put pieces around those guys and Desmond Bane to accentuate the things that they do well, you can compete. It is realistic to do similar things. You don't want to completely copy what the Mavericks are doing because you don't have a Luka Doncic. But especially in the front court, you have the resources in place that you can address those needs. And you already have 2/3 of that on your roster. Versatile front court play, the Grizzlies can check that box. And that's a positive development going into next season. We haven't even mentioned G.G. Jackson, who most certainly is a part of that process as well, as you think he can play the 4. Maybe he's not quite as good as Derrick Jones Jr. at this moment, but maybe he is. And if at 19 going into 20 years old, he's able to provide that kind of level of intensity coming off the bench, that makes him all the more valuable. Or even if he is a starter, you got Vince Williams Jr. in that mix as well. So the Grizzlies roster looks a lot more like the Mavericks roster than perhaps you imagine. They just have a Luka Doncic and a Kyrie Irving, and John Morant and Desmond Bane probably can't ascend to that level, but you can get close to that. And if Ja does develop his shot and does take a step in terms of tier up into that top 10, top 5 NBA player range, we could see a pretty phenomenal rivalry budding. And I'm excited about that. You should be as well. Let me know what you think in the comments. Am I off base with my positivity about watching Dallas and seeing the similarities to the Grizzlies roster? Do you agree, disagree? Let me know. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we are going to close out the show talking about the importance of patience. And before we get to that, I want to remind you about Locked On Sports Today, the very first of its kind on YouTube, 24/7 streaming channel, broadcasting shows like Locked On Grizzlies, but also during this time of year, Locked On Celtics, Locked On Mavericks, Locked On Pacers, Locked On Timberwolves, Locked On Wolves, all sorts of different shows for this playoff push and all that's going on across not just the NBA, but the NHL. Locked On Sports Today does a phenomenal job, both on YouTube as well as under the free Amazon Fire Channels app. Make sure you're checking out Locked On Sports Today now, or maybe after the show. That might be a better way to do it. When we come back, we'll talk being patient with the Grizzlies, a lesson to learn from both the Mavericks and the Celtics. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, closing out this episode of the show. No to Michael Cole. We miss him. Hopefully he's back on our show tomorrow. Maybe we take a look at some draft boards. Maybe we talk a little bit more about what the Grizzlies could do in free agency in theory. Lots of different angles we can take as the NBA Finals approach, and obviously June comes along with it. I want to close out this episode talking about the value of patience. And I think that that is something that in our society today, we lose sight of. And a lot of that ties back into the current frustrations with Taylor Jenkins, right? And I think they're valued. You know, I've gone on record on this show talking about how being 6-19 with Desmond Bane and John Morant in the with Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr. without John Morant, that's unacceptable. That never should have happened. The home record that Memphis posted this past year, also unacceptable. Any opportunity to reflect, reevaluate scheme, Taylor Jenkins should be doing all those things, not disputing any of that. But I do think that we have to remind ourselves of just how young this Grizzlies core is, right? Luka Doncic, I believe he's 25 years old, right? Right there along the same age, roughly, as Desmond Bane, John Morant, Jaren Jackson Jr. And there's no denying that that Luka Doncic is the best player on that Dallas Mavericks team. But who's the second best player on that Dallas Mavericks team? Kyrie Irving. And Kyrie Irving has been to the NBA Finals. He's been around the block a time or two, right? And that's the second best player on the team. Look at the Boston Celtics, the team that is most likely to come out of the Eastern Conference, go to the NBA Finals, be in that mix. Jason Tatum is in year 6 as an NBA player. Jaylen Brown's been around longer than him. Their third best player is Drew Holiday, who has literally won an NBA championship. Who is the Memphis Grizzlies' third best player? Either Desmond Bane or Jaren Jackson Jr., depending on how you feel. And Drew Holiday is a veteran compared to those guys. Obviously, Bane and Jaren and Ja have logged a lot of NBA minutes. And you could argue that Marcus Smart is their fourth best player, who maybe he's not Drew Holiday. Well, he's definitely not Drew Holiday. If he was Drew Holiday, Marcus Smart would still be in Boston. But the step down is significant, and that's the point that I'm trying to make. You could argue the fifth best player or the fourth best player for the Celtics is Derek White. The fifth best player is Kristaps Porzingis. Lots of veteran players who have been through the ringer both in the regular season and the postseason. The Dallas Mavericks are young in spots. They have some unproven guys. It goes against that a little bit, and I'm not disputing that. But the Kyrie Irving effect is significant for that Dallas team, and it's merged nicely together. So a lot of times we want stuff to happen before it's ready to happen, and that's the unfortunate reality of life, right? This instant gratification society that we live in. That's not how sports work, right? That's not how sports work. The Grizzlies are in a place where only this past offseason, right? Only the offseason of 2023 that they actually make a trade with a championship push in mind when they acquired Marcus Smart. That's the reality. They had not done anything else to that point to suggest that they were trying to contend for a championship. They were conducting business as if they were a rebuilding team, acquiring assets, not prioritizing acquiring the types of veterans that will help with developing a championship mentality. Smart was the first one in which they had to give up assets to acquire somebody like that. And that's great. That's why I keep asking my question, are we trying to win a championship or not? You want guys like that next to your stars. But we're seeing from Anthony Edwards, who's a couple years younger than Ja, the realities of when your best player is young. Edwards is exhausted. He has never been asked to do the things that he has been asked to do in these playoffs. And yes, they have Rudy Gobert and Mike Conley and Karl Anthony Towns. They have talented pieces around him. But the Wolves are still a couple of years away, more than likely, at least a year away, because their best guy is not ready to shoulder that weight the way that it is needed. And that's not a judgment. You most certainly can make the same statement about Ja Morant, just maybe in some different ways over the last couple of years. With youth comes inexperience. At times with youth comes immaturity. And you need to wait for those things to either age out, show themselves, be moved on from, whatever the case might be, in order for you to become what you are destined to be. We're seeing with the Celtics. How many times over the last couple of years have people called for trying to trade away Jaylen Brown? I remember doing numerous fake trades for Jaylen Brown. How awesome would it be to have Jaylen Brown on the Grizzlies? Super awesome. You know who's not going to be on the Memphis Grizzlies? Jaylen Brown. Because the Boston Celtics have prioritized keeping that core together. That's one of the reasons Boston is thriving right now, because they kept that core, those two guys together. The pieces around them have changed. I mentioned Marcus Smart no longer being there. The pieces around those guys have changed, but those two have been the constants. They've stayed the same. The Golden State Warriors before them, Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green. The pieces around those three guys changed, but those three stayed the same. Memphis would be wise to learn from history and be patient. You believe you have those three guys, Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, Jaren Jackson Jr. Patiently wait, put pieces around them that make sense, that accentuate their strengths and their skill sets, and let them find their way to the NBA championship. If you don't think they can do it after a couple more years, maybe you start thinking about moving on. But it is year 7 or so for Jaylen Brown. Year 6 or so for Jason Tatum. Luka Doncic, I believe, is in around year 6 or so. He was part of the same draft class as Jaren Jackson Jr. And Jaren is the 3rd best player on the Grizzlies, 2nd best, depending on who you ask. He's not the best, and he's not on the same plane as Luka Doncic. Patience. Build around that young core and let them come of age. The Memphis Grizzlies are about to bear the fruit of that labor. They're close. But you can't abandon that philosophy right at the cusp of that harvest, if that makes sense. You have invested in these guys. You have stuck with these guys. You have given them opportunity. Now it's time to put talent around them that makes their skill sets seem that much bigger and larger. Let them grow. Let them fall. Help them get up. Watch them lead your franchise to glory. Boston's done it. I think the Grizzlies can do it too. Patience is the virtue. But, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes waiting can be the very hardest part. Thank you so much for being with me on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. It's hard for you to wait to see DeMichael Cole again. I know that's the case. But he should be back on our Wednesday edition of the show. Again, take a look at the lay of the land in the NBA playoffs as we approach the finals. Maybe do another mock draft roundup. Donovan Clingan looking more and more like a possibility at number 9 overall. If that happens, I'll be a very happy camper. Talking about second-round picks, sleepers. We know the value of those second-rounders thanks to Vince Williams Jr. and Gigi Jackson. Lots of different angles we can take on our Wednesday edition of the show. Our Tuesday edition of the show. Oh, no, Wednesday edition. I'm getting my days cleaned up. Wednesday edition of the show. Sorry about that, everyone. Make sure you're with us. Check us out on Spotify, Amazon, Apple, YouTube. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, whatever the case might be. Make sure you are making our show here on Locked On Grizzlies a part of your everyday NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content consumption. I know DeMichael appreciates it, as do I. Hopefully you had a wonderful weekend and you're sprinting into the end of May. You're finishing the month strong, getting ready for a great June, just like we are here on Locked On Grizzlies. Thank you again 1,000 times. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe. I'm Joe Mullinax. We'll catch you next time here on Locked On Grizzlies. See ya.